Today we're north of Sydney, planning to hike part of the old Great North Road, an old convict-built route from the early 19th century designed to link Sydney and the Hunter Valley. While most of the route is no longer in use, many parts are being preserved as national park, as it contains some of the best preserved examples of convict craftsmanship in Australia. The backdrop of Dharug and Donnys National Parks, there's some great hiking in this area, including spots for an overnight stay. Unfortunately though, the main section around Divines Hill is currently closed for conservation works. So we're doing a section called the 10 Mile Hollow Circuit instead, hiking into the area on a normal bushwalk and then joining the old Great North Road around the 10 Mile Hollow Campground. We've also got the option of staying an extra night if we want to explore some more. All right, let's get moving. Thomas Nagel isn't your typical analytical philosopher. While many of his peers were busy dissecting the logic of language, Nagel was more interested in the questions that actually keep us up at night: death, absurdity, and the crushing weight of our moral choices. The 1970s were Nagel's golden era, a period where he produced a series of seminal essays eventually collected in this book, Mortal Questions, a text we've explored on this channel before. At the heart of Nagel's writings is a tension he calls the point of view problem. He argues that we are all trapped between two irreconcilable perspectives: the subjective I, the internal boots on the ground experience of being a person, and the objective view from nowhere, a detached, cold, scientific look at the world where we are just insignificant specks in a vast, indifferent universe. Nagel suggests that our deepest crises, whether they are about meaning, consciousness, or ethics, arise because we cannot fully inhabit either view, yet we also can't discard them. In a previous video, we looked at Nagel's work on consciousness through his famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? This time out on the trail and away from the digital haze, we're going to tackle his bleaker, more urgent work on morality. Nagel was writing War and Massacre in 1972 as a visceral response to the horrors of Vietnam. By reading his work against the backdrop of violence that dominates our screens today, it is staggering how little our moral grammar has evolved. Despite 50 years of progress, our ethical framework for conflict feels stuck in the same loop. We are still caught in the same moral blind alley Nagel identified over 50 years ago. The collision between the cold, utilitarian logic of state survival and the absolute, inalienable value of a human life. And as we stand on the precipice of a new kind of warfare, one driven by autonomous AI and black box algorithms, Nagel's questions about moral residue feel less like philosophy and more like an autopsy of our current age. Are we entering an era where our leaders can finally outsource their ethical obligations onto machines? And are we building digital masks that filter our impact and hide the faces of our victims, distilling the moral residue into mere statistical data points? On this hike, we're going to find out if Nagel still offers a way out of the moral blind alley, or if he's simply showing us how trapped we really are. Time for some drums.
Here we are, 10 Mile Hollow.
So we've just established the campsite. There are some other people at this location, so we've found a nice little quiet place in the corner, set up the tent, and then we're just going to take it easy for the rest of today. Tomorrow we'll go out and explore some of the old Great North Road, but for now, let's just relax. So we've been following the old Great North Road southbound for a while now, but haven't really found anything of interest. There's a few rock cutouts, but they're very small and not really noteworthy. So we're going to head back, but we're going to take a detour by the Wat Loop Track, and that will take us around back to the Great Old North Road further up north, and we'll see if there's anything of interest up there. There's a little spot here with a view. Let's take a look. Great modern crimes are public crimes. To a degree, the same can be said of the past, but the growth of political power has introduced a scale of massacre and despoliation that makes the efforts of private criminals, pirates, and bandits seem truly modest. Public crimes are committed by individuals who play roles in political, military, and economic institutions. Unless the offender has the originality of Hitler, Stalin, or Amin, the crimes do not seem to be fully attributable to the individual themselves. This is how Thomas Nagel describes the ruthlessness in public life, or a person's moral obligations change when they step into public office. He argues that we operate under two distinct, often contradictory moralities. Private morality is our human baseline. It governs our eye-to-eye relations with other individuals and governs our personal relationships and day-to-day encounters. However, public morality is the morality of the office. Whether you are a president, a general, or a judge, your primary duty shifts. You aren't paid to be a good person. You're paid to be an effective agent of the institution. According to Nagel, these officials act as office holders or functionaries, and thereby as individuals, they are insulated in a puzzling way from what they do. Insulated both in their own view and in the view of most observers. Even if one is in no doubt about the merits of the acts in question, The agents seem to have a slippery moral surface produced by their roles or offices. It is this insulation that allows them to sign a death warrant or authorize a deadly military strike and then go home and have a peaceful dinner with their family. The paradox is that we actually want our leaders to be ruthless. A leader who lets their nation be destroyed to keep their own conscience clean is seen as a failure. This is the silent contract, a psychological and structural arrangement that the public grants leaders a moral permit to be ruthless, so that we can continue to believe in our own purity. It is the ultimate form of moral outsourcing. The silent part of the contract is the agreement to maintain a useful delusion. As long as our leaders use the correct rhetoric, national security or surgical strikes, then we agree to look away. And because the act was official, we as citizens feel no personal guilt. We can enjoy the safety the strike provided while still identifying as a peace-loving person. But what happens when the moral residue becomes too visible to ignore? When a leaked video or a social media feed forces the gruesome reality through our front doors? Here, we don't need to admit our part in the contract. Instead, our leaders become the moral scapegoat, allowing us to turn on the leader and express horror at the very ruthlessness we silently expected of him. We sacrifice the leader to reset the nation's moral standing. By punishing them, we tell ourselves, that wasn't us, that was them. Then we renew the silent contract with a new clean leader, and the cycle begins again. However, today, in a world of ubiquitous mobile phones and instant uploads, the distance required for the silent contract is collapsing, and this moral shield is beginning to shatter. We are being forced back into the moral blind alley in real time. The useful delusion of sanitized war is becoming a loud, uncomfortable conversation about our shared responsibility. But as the old shields fail, are we just building new ones? As our wars become AI-driven, will massacres be rebranded as glitches or algorithmic errors? If a machine makes the choice, can we claim no one is the baddie? Does the precarious nature of our lives mean that we are too busy surviving the cost of living crisis to be moral agents? Or will we just shrug and say the world is evil and nothing really matters? Nagel's work is a direct assault on every one of these exits. His core message is simple and devastating. Responsibility is non-transferable. You cannot give your conscience to a leader. You cannot delegate it to an AI, and you cannot explain it away to the markets. If you benefit from the safety, if you support the policy, or if you perform even a tiny part of the machine's work, the moral residue belongs to you. We don't get to walk away clean. We must carry the weight. Only by acknowledging our own complicity do we retain the right to call ourselves moral beings. From the apathetic reaction to atrocities committed in Vietnam by the United States and its allies, one may conclude that moral restrictions on the conduct of war command almost as little sympathy among the general public as they do among those charged with the formation of US military policy. Nagel wrote these words in 1972, but his stark diagnostic of the Western psyche remains a haunting reflection of how we approach conflict today. When he speaks about apathy, he isn't describing simple boredom. He's describing a state of collective moral anesthesia, a sterilized world where the visceral horror of war is smoothed over by utilitarian math. In this calculation, the individual is reduced to a data point, and the massacre is rebranded as the regrettable and unfortunate cost of a necessary policy. It's a way of looking at the world from a distance so great that the people on the ground disappear, leaving only the greater purpose behind. At its core, Nagel's argument is a head-on collision between moral utilitarianism and absolutism. Most modern conflicts are recorded and justified through this utilitarian lens. This is the logic of the bird's eye view, or the view from nowhere, to use Nagel's terms. It is the idea that any action, no matter how horrific, can be balanced out if the final sum leads to a strategic win or the prevention of a larger catastrophe. But Nagel insists that this math is a trap. He argues for absolutism, the idea that the inherent nature of what you actually do to another human being remains an immovable moral consideration. It's the eye-to-eye view that refuses to let the individual be swallowed by statistics. To understand Nagel, we have to look at deontology, the school of thought that says we have a fundamental duty to perform or avoid certain acts, regardless of the outcome. Consider Immanuel Kant's famous example of the prudent shopkeeper. Imagine two shopkeepers serving a child. The first gives the correct change because he fears a bad reputation if he's caught cheating. The second does it simply because cheating is wrong. From a utilitarian perspective, these men are identical. The result is the same. The child has the right change. But Nagel, following Kant, points out that they are worlds apart. If morality is only about consequences, then humans are no different from vending machines. If a machine gives you the right change, we don't call it virtuous. It was just following its program. It had no choice. True morality only exists when a rational being chooses the path of duty, especially when that path conflicts with their own interests, safety, or strategic goals. It's the choice to remain human, despite what the numbers say. Nagel takes this Kantian foundation and pulls it into the real world, to what he calls absolutism. While deontology can sometimes feel like an abstract list of rules, absolutism is about the direct eye-to-eye relationship between the person acting and the person being acted upon. He argues that hostility is only moral when it is directed at a person in their capacity as a threat. The moment we target a civilian to send a message or to break the will of a people, we have stopped treating them as a person and started treating them as a prop. Even when innocent people are killed as human shields, Nagel insists that this is the definition of a massacre. And here is where Nagel refuses to look away. He won't let strategic necessity change the label. Even if the commander believes they must kill civilians to end the war quickly and save 1 million lives, Nagel insists that this still meets the criteria of a massacre. The utilitarian gain does not wash away the absolutist crime. This leads us to a state of moral residue. Even if a state claims it had no choice but to strike a civilian area to stop a greater evil, Nagel insists they must still carry the guilt of the crime. There is no such thing as a clean atrocity. This brings us to the most uncomfortable part of his philosophy, the moral blind alley. This is a no-win scenario where two valid systems demand opposite things. Utilitarianism demands you commit an atrocity to save the many, but absolutism forbids you from ever committing that atrocity. Nagel refuses to give us a clean exit. He acknowledges that a leader might find a massacre necessary to save a nation, but he insists that necessity does not equal justification. He denies us the moral exit we so desperately crave. In Nagel's eyes, you might be a necessary actor, but you are still a murderer. You must live with the moral residue, the permanent, unwashable stain that no strategic victory can erase. Nagel says, we must face the pessimistic alternative that these two forms of moral intuition are not capable of being brought together into a single, coherent moral system, and that the world can present us with situations in which there is no honourable or moral course for a man to take, no course free of guilt and responsibility for evil. To commit a massacre to save a nation doesn't make the act good. It simply makes it a tragedy. As he reminds us, it may be that one should sometimes or even always do the utilitarian right thing, but that does not mean that the absolutist prohibition ceases to apply. Because both sides of this equation are true, our world is inherently tragic. But there is a hidden mercy in this honesty. By calling an evil act evil, even when we feel forced to commit it, we prevent ourselves from becoming monsters. The moment we call a massacre good or righteous simply because it was necessary, we have lost our moral compass entirely. We have to realize that if the war is won through the blood of the innocent, we don't get to walk away as heroes. We must be brave enough to look in the mirror and acknowledge that in that moment, we were the baddies. Only by carrying that guilt, instead of denying it, do we remain human. We like to believe that if we're smart enough or good enough, there's always a path that keeps our hands clean. We want to believe that morality is a puzzle with a solution. But out here in the silence of the wilderness, Nagel's final conclusion feels much more honest. He suggests that the moral blind alley isn't a mistake, it's a feature of our existence. He reaches the conclusion that it is naive to suppose that there is a solution to every moral problem with which the world can face us. We have always known that the world is a bad place. It appears that it may be an evil place as well. So we're back at 10 Mile Hollow Campground, and tonight we've got the place to ourselves. So I think we're going to set up in this prime position here next to the campfire. Someone's left quite a bit of wood as well, so I think we're going to have a fire tonight. All right, let's get set up and then we can relax. Out here on the trail, we are confronted with a view from nowhere. The world is seen from the outside where there are no oughts, only is. In this view, nature is amoral. The mountain doesn't care about your virtues, and the stream doesn't have a code of conduct. But the moment we step into the wilderness, we bring our subjective view from here with us. We often treat hiking as a pure escape, but Nagel would argue it's actually an ecological blind alley. We perform a silent utilitarian calculation. We trade a bit of nature's integrity for our own spiritual growth. We accept the micro-erosion of our footsteps and the displacement of wildlife, all for the greater good of our own mental clarity. Aristotle would say that being a good hiker isn't about following a checklist of rules, it's about habituation. It's becoming a person for whom leaving no trace or staying on the path is a psychological necessity. But Nagel adds a more tragic layer. He reminds us that even if we are perfectly virtuous, our presence is still a violation. To believe we are a hero out on the trail is a convenient illusion, but to stay home and remain pure is the act of a moral egoist. The true Nagelian hiker chooses the third path. They are the person who chooses the hike, accepting the necessary good of seeking perspective and air, but at the same time admits the complicity, acknowledging that their presence, their consumption of the landscape, leaves a stain. Essentially, they carry the moral residue, treating the guilt not as a burden to the soul, but as a weight that makes them move more softly and fight harder for the protection of the places they've used. Perhaps the most honest way to finish a hike is not with a feeling of conquest, but with a quiet apology to the trail. We got what we needed: growth, fresh air, and a new perspective. We don't try to justify it with rhetoric, and we don't pretend our hands are clean. We simply acknowledge that the mountain paid a small price for our humanity. We don't get to walk away clean, we must carry the weight. Only by acknowledging our own complicity, we retain the right to call ourselves moral beings. But the guilt isn't there to paralyze us. It's there to ensure we never stop negotiating with the world. Right, we're back on the track we came in on. That was the Dubbo Gully circuit, staying over at the 10 Mile Hollow Campground. It's a pretty easy walk, mostly just fire trail, but there were a few places of note along the way, including some old convict ruins that were quite interesting. A few decent views. I think the Wat Loop Track was probably the most interesting section. And the 10 Mile Hollow Campground is pretty nice, although you do get a few people there on the weekend. But in all, it's a fairly cruisy overnighter, but I think there are much better hikes around Sydney. That said, I will be back to explore more of the old Great North Road and hopefully find some more of those convict ruins.